Hello and welcome back to Actions, the Responses to Trafficking podcast. I'm Kathryn Baldacchino, and this is a podcast where I speak to people who are working in different ways to respond to trafficking in order to help share their work with other people also working in the field. Today, I've spoken to Euan Fraser, who is the Public and Corporate Affairs Manager at the International Justice Mission. We talk about the work he's doing with the UK government on international responses to trafficking, and also his work on responding to the online sexual exploitation of children. We spoke in December 2020. Thanks for watching this episode, and please get in touch with any feedback or further questions via @ActionsPodcast on Twitter, and please consider subscribing to this YouTube channel. Welcome back to Actions. Today, I'm speaking with Euan Fraser, who is the Public and Corporate Affairs Manager at the International Justice Mission, IJM, here in the UK. Hi, Euan. Great to see you.
Hi, Kat. Great to be here.
Yeah, it's been a while, so I'm really looking forward to this catch up.
Yeah. I think it's been since maybe January.
Probably.
Since we got up. So yeah.
Loads to catch up on, loads of ground to cover. Let's get started with some information about yourself. For those that don't know you, can you tell us a bit about yourself and your background?
Sure. Yeah. So I, as you say, I work for International Justice Mission in the UK. Normally based in our London office, but since this whole debacle began, I have been up in Scotland, which has been nice. And prior to that, prior to working for IGM, I started out on my, journey working in the anti-trafficking sector at university. I studied law, and in particular, kind of human rights law. And during my master's, I volunteered with Stop the Traffic, and it was just around the time that legislation was coming into place in Scotland, the Human Trafficking and Exploitation Bill. And yeah, I did some campaigning around that, and realised that I was probably more suited to the advocacy type work rather than the legal work, and so sought that as a bit of a career change before the first career even got started, and worked for the Human Trafficking Foundation then for 3 years, so focusing primarily on victim support policy in the UK, and then made the shift to IGM a couple of years ago.
Brilliant. And that's when I first started working with you, and I was first introduced to you, I think, in probably your first week at Human Trafficking Foundation, so quite some time ago. And about this current role, Public and Corporate Affairs Manager, what does that involve? What does that even mean?
Sure. So I guess my role is kind of split in that half of my job is engaging with the UK government on their response to slavery and other forms of violence internationally. So bringing some of the lessons which our teams around the world doing casework, bringing the lessons of their experience and feeding that into helping to shape the UK government's response. And then also seeing how our approach and our model can maybe help businesses on the other side of my job to address risks of exploitation in their supply chains. So quite a nice varied role, but all kind of about bringing the lessons from our teams to people in the UK who can hopefully bring about some change.
That's so interesting. And that's such a great value of IJM specifically. And when I was speaking to Hope for Justice a few weeks ago, they mentioned the same about having international colleagues as part of the same organization, and being able to share that learning across borders is one of the greatest values, I guess, of having that international experience.
Yeah, it's incredible. So we've got colleagues in doing the actual hard work in I think 13 countries.
Wow.
And all really varied, and not all of it is related to slavery. So most of our offices work on issues of slavery and exploitation of some kind, but also violence against women and children, police abuse of power. Yeah, so a nice variety, and it kind of, I think, being able to give their kind of experience when speaking with government is amazing. They're really quite inspiring.
Absolutely. And I'm looking forward to finding out more about the organisation in a minute. But firstly, you've worked in the trafficking sector for a few years, as you've described. What is it that motivates you about this field and now about your job in particular?
Gosh, well, I think what struck me working, what prompted me to work in this field initially was that I felt it wasn't an issue that got much attention. So when I was studying human rights, it hardly got, it was hardly covered, human trafficking, which struck me as odd. And the more I dug into it, the more I thought, well, this really kind of, this deserves my attention as just a really horrendous form of injustice. I guess there's just something about aggressive, greedy people taking violent advantage of a person's vulnerability that I just find particularly difficult and want to push back against. So I guess that was kind of the starting point. And then I guess getting to one of the great things about working at the Human Trafficking Foundation was getting to really know people in the sort of right across the anti-trafficking sector. NGOs, academics, law enforcement, and just the sort of collaborative nature of a lot of people in the sector has been so encouraging. And actually, like, initiatives like this podcast are really kind of a really lovely sort of demonstration of the kind of the breadth of the sector and the kind of the talent and dedication that's involved by people working in it. So it's just lovely to be part of that and to sort of play my little role in it.
Absolutely. Yeah, and definitely agree and feel the same, that there is clearly a lot of passion and a lot of compassion as well in the sector.
Yeah.
And yeah, really interesting to hear about the initial motivating factors for you too. Thank you. So now let's take the opportunity to delve more into the organisation. So International Justice Mission. Can you give a short overview of what the organisation is and what it does?
Sure. So as I say, we work on a variety of issues, not just related to modern slavery, but violence against women and children, police abuse of power, and modern slavery. But essentially, regardless of the type of casework that it is, the kind of basic premise is broadly similar in that we look to work alongside local authorities, local law enforcement and local government, and support basically the justice system to respond more effectively to violence, to provide more meaningful protection for individuals and vulnerable communities, to tackle impunity. And essentially what we do is that we partner with the local authorities right from the initial investigation, so helping to identify people who are in exploitation. We then partner with them to help them out when they're ready to leave exploitation, and then into support, and that's often with partners or it's local authority care, depending on the situation. And we will sort of journey with them for as long as it takes for them to kind of rebuild their confidence and their independence. And whilst doing that, we'll also work with the authorities again to see that traffickers are prosecuted, so that there is accountability. And essentially, by kind of following a case right from that initial investigation all the way through, it kind of lets us see the gaps and the faults, and we can then help respond. So whether or not that's a lack of resources or a lack of will or a lack of understanding, we can then sort of provide the training that's required. Yeah, and we kind of, it's kind of that there's kind of those two elements of making sure that survivors actually receive the protection that they need, and also seeing that justice is done in terms of laws being enforced. And we've kind of seen that when a justice system is kind of properly equipped to proactively identify instances of trafficking, and know how to interview survivors in a way which isn't going to re-traumatize them, and knows how to look after their interests and their welfare. And you couple that with accountability, that you can kind of make real changes and cultural changes where that impunity has become quite embedded. Yeah, we've seen quite sort of amazing shifts in that.
That's so fascinating. And that is something that I've always found particularly interesting about IJM's approach and model, because of that real holistic view of trafficking response. So you work quite closely with authorities, but equally ensure that there's aftercare and support programs in place as well. And I guess one of the key reflections coming to the surface in the trafficking sector is this more holistic view of understanding the recovery of people from exploitation and the need to connect that with proper support programs. And this is something that really comes through a lot in your activity. So can you flesh out a little bit more of the effectiveness of how that works, and you know, the connection of working with authorities, yet also ensuring that there's enough time and space for people afterwards to, you know, recover and rebuild?
Yeah, it's not an easy one. Yeah, I think like the survivor's welfare obviously has to be the the first priority. And we've developed a kind of a tool for helping to guide our aftercare. So when someone sort of initially comes out of exploitation, there's a sort of a risk assessment tool, essentially, to make sure that that support can be tailored to their individual needs. And I guess that sits alongside the fact that, and in many cases, those individuals are the ones who hold the evidence. And if there is to be accountability, if those traffickers are to face any consequence, then survivors need to be supported to give that evidence, and they need to know that they're doing that in a way which isn't going to have negative repercussions. They need to have worked through their trauma to be able to express it freely and confidently, and they need to give informed consent to do so, and all that, and that all takes time. But I think, I don't think that the two things can really be disconnected. I think that they're kind of intrinsically, in many cases, intrinsically linked. That getting justice for their trafficker is part of that recovery. Is part of being believed. It's quite important.
Absolutely. And I think more and more authorities are starting to acknowledge actually that victim care and support is going to be helpful because of all of these things, right? Exactly like you've said, they hold the evidence. We have a higher chance of people cooperating with these processes, if they feel that their needs are properly being supported. And often I guess some authorities will recover people from exploitation without care and support programs in place, and they could be exited into further harm when that happens. So I think that's quite a compelling case for why these things need to be connected, and the importance and the value of IJM providing both just helps, I guess, that really smooth transition from one issue, one aspect to the next.
Yeah, I think we don't do our casework in the UK, but it's something that's an issue which I guess has been a live issue here, is the best practice being for NGOs to accompany police if they're going to visit a location where they believe that there are people being exploited, to make sure that there is that safe voice, and that person that is going to certainly prioritize the welfare and make sure that support is given as needed. And there's often sort of been police saying that police sometimes have to be investigator and social worker at the same time, and that just doesn't work. So having NGOs present from that very beginning, so that you make the most of that very first contact, I think is really crucial.
Internationally, IJM does that work, and in the UK, your work is more policy focused. Is that right?
Yeah. We've been so I guess there's 6 offices like ours in the UK, and they do a mixture of awareness raising, fundraising, and also advocacy. So that's where my role comes in, taking the lessons from that casework and sharing with UK government, and helping to sort of shape and inform their response as much as possible.
Excellent. That's so valuable. And so we're going to delve into 2 aspects of your work in particular. So firstly, we're going to talk about your work with the UK government on international responses to trafficking. And then secondly, we're going to talk about your work on responding to the issues of online sexual exploitation of children. So in the first instance, can we talk a bit about the international trafficking responses? Can you tell us more about what that is and what that work involves?
Sure. So obviously, I think we're quite fortunate in many ways. It's probably not said enough that the UK has made modern slavery a priority in recent years, and done a fair amount to raise this issue on the international stage. And I don't think we should kind of take that for granted. Things like the call to action at the General Assembly, or in the Universal Periodic Review, or even the supply chain requirements and the kind of international implications of that, in terms of raising an issue. I think that is, credit where it's due, for that. I think certainly the question which then arises is then turning that into action and impact, and actually seeing a reduction in the prevalence of modern slavery. And I think this is something which has come up in the recent report from the ICAI, the Independent Commission on Aid Impact. So they have done a review of international spending on modern slavery, and identified a few areas for improvement. And so I guess I'm hopeful that that will spark, I suppose, the next phase of the international modern slavery movement, which is very driven by seeing the tangible impact. So the ICAI highlighted things like impact and strategy, and gaps in our understanding around modern slavery. So yeah, I guess I would like to see a government response which really seeks to kind of address those, and I appreciate the context in which we're operating of COVID and Brexit next year and everything, but to really kind of go about these issues with, I guess, the urgency that I think they're probably due.
So you are right about the UK in some ways trailblazing or leading other countries with regards to its response on trafficking. What's your view on the UK's ability to influence other countries with regards to developing responses on trafficking?
Yes, I think we have seen some evidence of at least that initial first step of helping countries to engage with the issue. So things like the call to action, which has had, I don't know how many countries signed up to it, but quite a few countries have signed up for the call to action. British embassies have begun to take on the issue and have had some local responses, and varies from country to country, but that can be relatively influential and can have a positive impact in terms of at least a convening role. So I think I don't think that should be kind of understated. As I say, I think it then kind of the question arises as to, and so what? Now that we've got your attention, what do we do with it? And I think that is, making, the call to action is great. How do we then make sure that those who have signed on to it are following through and are actually delivering? And I think the UK is obviously an interesting point in time in terms of global standing, and that's obviously been redefined by lots of things. But the FCDO, the merger, of the Foreign Office and DFID into the FCDO, will obviously, I think, have quite a big role to play in terms of influence, or determining the level of influence. And I guess my hope is that modern slavery can be one of those issues where the UK still kind of looks to drive up standards, to kind of build on what has been done in recent years. That's my hope, and that's, I guess, what we're pushing for, because I think the UK, having sort of carved out a bit of a niche for itself on the global stage on modern slavery, can then play a really important role.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And so it's really interesting to hear about the approach of even high commissions and embassies being able to sort of promote it within their contexts, and that seems to be getting some traction as well. In terms of country collaboration and models of one country sort of helping another country to develop a response, are you seeing any good practice examples or positive collaborations that you can share?
Well, actually, I think, I think the embassy and ambassador point is another factor that we kind of don't know, but will be interesting to see how it plays out. I think with the new FCDO, ambassadors and embassies are going to play a bigger part in what direction they go in. They're going to have more say and more control. So that will be interesting to see how they choose to use that influence and that power. So that, again, will be something else to kind of speak into, and hopefully modern slavery will be prioritized, and perhaps might even allow for responses to be a little more tailored to local context. We have to wait and see exactly how that plays out. I think in terms of collaboration, one kind of quite interesting area is in our work in the Thai fishing industry. So that is a kind of an unusual project for us. It looks to address exploitation in the Thai fishing industry, where workers are brought from across the region,
Right.
trafficked from across the region.
Mm-hmm.
And that work is actually a partnership with Walmart, who have obviously identified that as an area of high risk in their supply chains, and have partnered with us to help address that. And I think that's quite an interesting approach from them, because there's obviously the minimum requirements. We obviously, in UK terms, know about the transparency and supply chains requirements, but it's kind of interesting to see a company kind of going a step beyond what is that requirement, and kind of looking at the broader context that they're sourcing from, and looking to change that, which I think is interesting. And also, I guess the collaboration across the trafficking corridors in the region. So we've got an office in Thailand and an office in Cambodia. And so it's interesting to see that collaboration work to address trafficking networks at both ends in terms of supply and demand. And I think that can have real impact in terms of providing, it's not simply a case of addressing the problem in Thailand, but looking at what are some of the vulnerabilities being created in Cambodia, or Myanmar, or wherever else workers are being exploited from.
So interesting. Can you talk more about the Walmart collaboration and the work in the Thai fishing industry? Because I just think that's such a interesting aspect and something that does get mentioned in the UK, but I guess without much attention. So I just think it would be really interesting to find out more about how that collaboration works and IJM's role in that partnership.
Yeah, so I guess a few years ago now, I can't remember exactly when, but there was obviously a fair bit of publicity about exploitation in the industry, and Walmart provided funding for an independent study which kind of looked at the problem in greater detail. So who was being exploited? What sort of boats were they being exploited on? Where were the workers coming from? What were the particular ports that were particularly vulnerable? Kind of a whole thorough study, and involved, interviews with fishermen, and just a lot of the details are really, really kind of troubling. I think of those who were interviewed, I think that the researchers could quite happily confirm, not happily, easily confirm that about 40% had been trafficked, that another 50% showed signs of trafficking. So only about 10% actually had fair wages and good working conditions. So just a huge problem. And I think, the thing which stood out for me from reading the research was that 6% had seen a co-worker murdered at sea. So I think, that, I guess, working in the sector, you get used to hearing terrible stories and terrible statistics. But when you hear about that kind of level of violence, it still stands out, and it doesn't stop being shocking. So that study was carried out, and following that, Walmart co-funded us to set up an office in Thailand and begin our casework model. So we work with the Thai authorities doing the work which I described earlier of helping to identify fishermen who are being exploited and helping them into support. Our teams in Cambodia are doing likewise of identifying people who have been trafficked, or at risk of being trafficked. And yeah, I think it's interesting because obviously there is the transparency in supply chains requirement in the UK, and I think that has been an important first step in terms of, as I say, as an example of just kind of getting things onto the radar. There's been problems with compliance, there's been problems with quality of statements, but for a number of companies, it's helped get it on the agenda. And that's great. And companies can and should do everything they can within their own power, and agreements with their suppliers and doing their own due diligence and all that. But if you're operating in a context where workers' rights just aren't protected, where there isn't proper regulation or resourcing to make sure that workers are being protected, then those agreements and with suppliers risk being undermined. So I think it's an interesting approach for a company to kind of look not just at their own little piece of the problem and solution, but to kind of look a bit beyond. And part of that is, it's not just a funding, but it's kind of doing advocacy to the local government to again call for improved response from the Thai government too.
And that really resonates and is just so compelling about the role that businesses and companies can play in helping to address this. So part of the responsibility or part of the impetus behind this doesn't only necessarily have to come from the voluntary sector or from authorities, but can come from the business sector as well. And they have a really fundamental role to play in this too.
Yeah, I mean, some businesses have problematic practices, and there's no hiding from that. But it's kind of undeniable that they are so kind of intrinsically involved that they certainly have a role to play, and can be a quite powerful and influential voice. So, and I think as a movement and as a sector, we kind of need to gather everyone of goodwill to be on board with it.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And another thing I really like about this example that you've shared about this collaboration is that it highlights the role of the voluntary sector vis-a-vis police and authorities as well. And again, this is another area that I'm particularly interested in with regards to IJM's work, because this is something that you have extensive experience in. Can you share more about how do you manage that particular relationship, the sort of balance between supporting and collaborating with authorities and wanting to improve their practice and make them better and help them to carry out their role, but also being mindful of the perception that survivors have in engaging with authorities and perhaps being skeptical that maybe authorities are always looking after their best interests. How does IJM kind of walk the line between these two concerns?
Yeah, that's a problem the world over. So I guess what we aim to do is, the context of which we're entering into are situations where exploitation, modern slavery is rampant, and there has been little or no attempt to really protect people who are vulnerable to exploitation. And so I guess you're starting from a fairly low ebb. What we look to do, and obviously that within that there's reasons for that. There's lack of political will, there's corruption, there's involvement in it in some situations. So what we aim to do is identify those people who are as appalled by it as we are, within, whether that's within law enforcement or that's within government or whoever that is, to identify those people and support them and enable them to, I guess, change culture and change attitudes within their own organizations. That doesn't necessarily translate to the survivor when they come out, because they don't know any better. They've probably been told or experienced themselves abuse at the hands of authorities. So it's a case of providing that expert support, working to build trust, which is a slow process. Accompanying, I think, from the outset is key. I think so much of it comes down to individual relationships in terms of them being willing to trust us. I know that we have their best interests at heart.
Yeah, and I guess just really acknowledging the amount of time that takes too, and that it's not an instantaneous thing. And sometimes there is a need for that to be over an extended period to help develop that trust and break down those barriers.
Yeah, for sure.
So this is all extremely interesting, and I have a million more questions for you about your international work, but because of time, can we move on to the other aspect of your work that we wanted to discuss today, which is responding to online sexual exploitation of children? So can you tell us more about what that particular aspect of work involves for you?
Sure. So this work is, I guess, led by our team in the Philippines, who are amazing. Of all the pieces of work, areas of work that we work on, I think this is the one that I kind of, I guess I struggle to know how they do it every day. It's really hard. So just, I guess, to be clear, because there's lots of variations and aspects to this particular form of abuse, but what we focus on primarily is the live streaming of sexual abuse of children. So sex offender in the UK paying to direct and live stream the abuse of a child in the Philippines. And what we've seen is that often those kids are really young. Often it's parents or family friends who are involved in facilitating the contact abuse in the Philippines.
Yeah.
So it's really difficult. And as I say, our teams in the Philippines previously worked on commercial sexual exploitation of children. So I guess more traditional forms of sexual exploitation. And what they've seen when moving to the online space is that the kids are younger. I think, the majority, I think, are sort of under 12 years. We've rescued toddlers and babies who are months old. So it's really troubling. So that's why I don't know really how they work on these issues every day. But they are working. I mean, you were talking about collaboration earlier. So we were one of the founding members of the Philippine Internet Crimes Against Children Center, or PICAC. And that's a collaboration of Philippine law enforcement, the UK NCA, Australian law enforcement, and IJM. And so I think that's been a bit of a game changer in terms of facilitating information sharing between those countries and helping with the response. And, again, what we talked about before, dismantling these things at source and demand. So, yeah, a very difficult area, but I think an area where, and a problem which is vast, and we can't, I think, possibly really know the size of it, in part because it's just not detected. I think that's one of the challenges, one of the many challenges in this, is that sort of live streamed abuse simply isn't detected. just an additional challenge. But hopefully kind of an area where we're seeing with the likes of PICAC, and actually just recently some new codes of practice from the government about responsibilities for tech companies, potentially sort of at the point of turning a corner, but it's a long way to go.
And was that guidance from the government of the Philippines, or is that the UK government?
Oh no, it's the UK government.
Okay.
Yeah. So it comes from the Online Harms white paper, and it introduces a new duty on. It covers all forms of online grooming and radicalization and all sorts of things. But one of the things is online child abuse, and we'll introduce a new duty on technology companies to make sure that they're doing what they can to make sure their platforms aren't being used. It's only, at the minute, it's only a voluntary, non-binding requirement, or it will be, but hopefully in time, or the intention is certainly in time, that it will become binding. So that's something that we'll be kind of helping to push for.
Yeah, that's extremely harrowing. And the work, as you say, like your colleagues, it's incredible that they managed to do that day in and day out. And I'd seen, I think my first exposure to this was, I think it was featured, IJM's work was featured in a news broadcast a couple of years ago. And there was your colleagues being interviewed about the work that they do. And it seems that they're, as you described, quite embedded within local police forces and really, detecting and trying to intercept and then rescue children from this situation.
Yeah. So they work in really close partnership, and I guess so. They're doing that in the Philippines, whilst we in the UK are looking at addressing some of the demands. So some of that is involving the tech companies, but the UK is the third largest consumer of live stream abuse in the world. So if you don't address that demand somehow, then you might solve it in the Philippines, but it will move somewhere else. And so that there's obviously various elements to that. I think the scale of the problem, again, is very hard to judge. We just published a report which looked at the issue of sentencing for those who are convicted of this in the UK, and there's a trend of quite lenient sentencing, and a bit of a difference in terms of abusing children who are in the Philippines versus in the UK. So that's, I guess, an area where we'd like to see some change. But there's also, there's the scale is such that there needs to be a broader response than a simply law enforcement response. There needs to be elements of early intervention, and I think understanding what leads someone into that abuse, I still don't think is fully understood. So I think addressing that and making sure that there's kind of early intervention services for would-be offenders is going to be part of the picture as well.
Yeah, and that really does highlight the need to have very multifaceted, multi-pronged responses, exactly like you're saying, a law enforcement response and preventative, and I guess also connects to the conditions in the Philippines where families are putting children into these abusive situations as well. What happens in the Philippines once the police intervene and once a child is removed from a situation like that? Do you know what happens then and what happens to the families?
So it depends. Sometimes it's often children will be taken into local authority care. If it is not safe for them to return to their parents, then presume foster arrangements or adoption is looked at. Yeah, kind of very much depends on parental involvement. Yeah, it's one of those things which it's just kind of, it's very hard to see what is a good outcome in this.
Absolutely, yeah.
At least in the in the immediate term. I mean, we've seen some survivors, grow up and sort of flourish and are inspiring characters. But that's great that they have overcome. But certainly in that kind of immediate kind of crisis moment, is all options are difficult, and again requires time.
Yeah, completely agree. Are you seeing any change in behavior or prevalence? Like, is it still too early to tell, or are you seeing a sort of a trend moving away from this form of abuse?
Unfortunately not. I know I was saying in terms of potentially turning a corner for some of the, I guess, frameworks in place, but this year has been a little bit of a disaster for this kind of abuse. It's kind of created the perfect storm of sex offenders, lockdown, spending more time at home, online. The Philippines are still in full lockdown. Families in quite desperate situations. It's just kind of the perfect storm, and it's very hard to get an accurate picture in terms of numbers or in terms of prevalence, but there have been lots of increases in reports, and likes of Europol and other sort of international bodies like that have expressed a lot of concern about what the lockdown has meant for this very particular kind of abuse.
Yeah, I think a lot of people share that concern, and I think it's going to start to become more exposed in coming months and years about what the consequences have been, and of the economic crisis that followed, and the ramifications of lockdown, and the further dangers and harms people have remained in or become more at risk of as a result of measures to respond to COVID.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I think we've seen increased vulnerability across our casework. In cases of violence against women and children and domestic violence, huge increases in vulnerability there, and in modern slavery cases in our casework there too. But yeah, this online abuse feels particularly stark and particularly troubling, and it's it's going to be a very difficult trend to reverse. But I guess the hope comes from I guess the fact that authorities and our teams have continued to work throughout the lockdown, and provided support and been able to help over 100 kids out of exploitation this year. So there's a long way to go, but there are kind of little pockets of hope in there too.
Yeah, absolutely. And really important to hold on to those as well to kind of carry on with this. And so are there any, so you've mentioned that there's been people actually recovered during this year, which has been clearly real positive. And one of the positives being that people are still continuing, your colleagues are continuing to work on this and persevere. Can you draw on any other sort of summarizing good practices or good examples that might be helpful to share?
Yeah, I mean, I think that international collaboration is what's going to be key in this. That's obviously vital. I think the role for technology companies and social media companies is going to be really important. I mean, that's another thing to say about this. This isn't something which is happening on dark web. This is happening on all the forms of communication that we've all been using to keep in touch during these lockdowns as well. So there's a real, I think, onus on companies to be proactive and to be innovative. As I say, I think there's the real challenge around detection in this, and so yeah, there are small pockets of, I guess, relatively small companies looking for innovative solutions to that, and there's all sorts of complications and privacy rights and what have you. But ultimately, child protection has to come first in these situations. So yeah, there's it's difficult to find the positives, but there are definitely some there, and there's some people really pushing to find solutions for that detection issue, which would just be a game changer.
Definitely. Yeah. Okay. That's really good to know, really. And the role of, tech companies and businesses and the collaboration with police forces, law enforcement across countries as well, and that continuous support from IJM in the different countries, kind of being that bridging sort of link between all the different actors, clearly is a strength too.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, Euan, that is all the time we have today. So we've sort of covered hugely interesting topics, and I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast and sharing your work with me.
Thank you so much. It's been lovely. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And yeah, congratulations on the podcast. I think it's great, and it's a great celebration of a lot of hard work in the sector and a lot of diligence. So it's great to be part of it.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Thank you for your feedback as well. That is really brilliant. And you're exactly the target audience. So it's perfect that you enjoy it. If people would like to get in touch or find out more about your work, about the work of IJM, what should they do?
They can go to our website, igmuk.org. They're welcome to get in touch directly with me, Euan.Fraser@igmuk.org. Socials, IJM UK. Yeah, delighted to hear from people.
Super. That's great. So I'm sure people will be in touch because there's loads there that I think would be really great to find out more about. Thank you again, Euan, for your time. And thanks also to the listeners or the viewers. Until the next time, the next one, goodbye.
Bye.
You've been listening to Actions, Responses to Trafficking podcast. Music used in this episode is Inspiration, written by Rayful Crux and sourced from freepd.com. Actions is produced and presented by Kathryn Baldacchino.